to see the way something like finances actually impacts your health and wellness, like directly in real time. That was really kind of a crazy experience and awakening for me.
Yeah, it really takes a toll.
Welcome back to On the Horizon. This is Melrose Michaels. I am your host, and I'm here to share what's worked for me in building my adult creator business to try to make building yours just a little bit easier. Let's get into today's episode.
Sex Work Today is a powerful and eye-opening book that dives deep into the modern realities of sex work, and I found it to be incredibly informative and a nuanced read. It covers everything from the impact of digital platforms on sex work, like camming, sugar dating, and even AI sex dolls, to the systemic challenges workers face due to criminalization and discriminatory practices. What stood out to me mostly was how intersectional it is, giving voice to marginalized groups like trans workers, people of color, and those with disabilities, showing how their experiences are uniquely shaped by overlapping oppressions. The essays don't shy away from the tough realities of exploitation, but they also highlight the joy, autonomy, and community building aspects of this work. It left me thinking a lot about the importance of decrim, labor rights, and policies that actually protect workers instead of pushing them further into harm's way. It is a must read for anyone who wants to understand the sex industry through a lens of humanity, activism, and progress. And today we have on one of its contributors, Val Webber, joining us to discuss in detail, and I could not be more excited to dive in. Val is a researcher and advocate with over 15 years of experience in the adult industry. Val's work focuses on the intersections of pornography, public health, ethics, and the regulation of sexuality. As a postdoctoral fellow at the Shag Lab and board chair of PASS, they're deeply involved in studying how policies and platforms shape the lives of sex workers. In Sex Work Today, Val contributes a powerful chapter on how financial discrimination and content moderation harm online sex workers, highlighting the very real world impacts of these systems. Val, thank you so much for coming on and making the time today. I'm super excited to chat with you.
It is my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So you spent 15 years navigating the adult industry, and you now contribute obviously critical research on pornography, public health, ethics, and alike. Your chapter in Sex Work Today kind of tackles financial discrimination and the content moderation issues that are profoundly impacting sex workers in the digital space specifically. I was wondering if you could share a bit about your journey and how kind of your background and experiences shaped your approach to these topics.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So I actually started webcamming straight out of high school back in 2002, and from the start, really interacted with the way that Visa and MasterCard shaped what I could and couldn't do online. So while the chapter deals, I'm sure we'll get into it. While the chapter deals with the more recent iteration of MasterCard and Visa's rules, they always had special rules. And I remember, my first days of training, because back then you went into a brick and mortar studio. No one had fast enough internet at home. And we were given a manual of here's everything that you can and can't do online. And we all understood that it had something to do with the credit cards, but I didn't really know the nuance of it all back then. But really from the start, it was this experiential part of, feeling these restrictions on what I could and couldn't do expression wise and how I could and couldn't make money. So from the very start of getting involved in online sex work, and then I went on to do sort of fetish content, and back in the days of Craigslist gigs and things that I miss dearly now. But having these interactions and always reflecting on my work as a worker with a bit of a kind of researcher brain. And then later on, I also got involved in when I was doing my undergrad, I got involved working with an HIV organization, doing like sexual education and public health stuff. And then my PhD, I wound up focusing on sexual health, like occupational health for porn production. So I've always really been interested in the intersections of regulation and ethics and what we can and can't do in adult content. So that's all culminated in this chapter. Yeah.
Absolutely. With a book this like diverse and nuanced, do you think, like, I guess what parts of it make it such an important resource for sex workers and their allies? Because that's what I really look at this book as. It's like a new resource that we're going to have available for, chapters to come.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I haven't actually gotten a copy of the book yet, so I can't speak to all the other chapters, but I've seen, the table of contents, and I know a lot of these names, and it's just such a really excellent mix of people with frontline experience as sex workers, with long histories in advocacy, and researchers who are, I think, the most respected ones in the field. And then there's some names that I don't know, so I'm really excited to discover up and coming writers and researchers or people that I haven't been exposed to yet. But it's really taking as its base labor issues, right? That is the sort of grounding force, I think, drawing all of these different sections together. So a book really by and for workers, and as you mentioned in the intro, like with a very intersectional approach, really looking to address impacts that maybe haven't been covered as thoroughly in other collections.
If you're enjoying this podcast episode so far, please take one moment to share it with another one of your adult content creator friends, because you know what the rule is here. We do not gatekeep, and we want to make as many adult creators' businesses as easy as possible. And you sharing this episode with them might do exactly that. Thanks so much in advance.
I can't believe you don't have a copy. I should send you I have a PDF.
Oh yeah, I know they're headed. I got a PDF of the earlier version, yes, but
Okay, so
I
that's
haven't
what I
gotten
read then.
my physical copy yet. And I love to read a hard copy. Get the highlighters out.
Yes, absolutely. So your chapter, which I guess that maybe we should focus there, it addresses the financial discrimination and then the content moderation impacts of online sex workers. So can you give us kind of an overview of your key findings specifically?
Yeah, so I guess the short and dirty version is essentially that when I'm sure a lot of people on the call will be familiar with the New York Times saga of I guess it was December 2020, that there was this op-ed written that accused Pornhub of really maliciously or intentionally profiting off of CSAM and other non-consensual content, and that really drove a slew of activity around the credit card processors who withdrew their services from Pornhub and went about making some new and updated guidelines. And so, what I tried to capture in this chapter is the impact that those new guidelines had. Like I said, there was always credit card rules that were specific to adult content, but they really intensified around this moment. And just even the announcement of these incoming rules made waves across different platforms. So what I found in surveying content creators was basically, these new rules caused major disruptions to people's work, to their income, and ultimately to their health and well-being because of that. And that it was kink creators and BIPOC creators and creators who were doing sort of more marginalized content that were most impacted by these regulations.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting too. We survey here at SWR Data at my other company. We survey creators, and we did our first survey in 2022. We did our most recent here in 2024, and there's similar data about like loss of revenue and things like that that points to the marginalized communities being most impacted over the recent years. So it's very, relevant to kind of your findings here as well, because those changes in regulation reached far and wide and very quickly. Something you mentioned was about specifically like health and wellness of the creators, especially marginalized communities. Are there specific things that stand out that were impacted?
Yeah, so of course, at the time, we were more locked down around COVID-19, and a lot of people talked about how the impact on their online revenue meant that they were feeling pressure to go and do more in-person work, whether that was in-person sex work or other kind of straight gigs. And so there was a lot of concerns around COVID-19 exposure and risk. And then, as you mentioned, a lot of these chapters deal with people with different disabilities and how people with disabilities are sort of overly represented or disproportionately represented in sex work because sex work tends to be a more accessible kind of labor. And so people with disabilities talking about the struggle to return to types of work that were too mentally and physically straining, really, to be sustainable because they were needing to make up for that lost revenue. So physical health risks in that regard, as well as mental health risks, and also just the general mental health strain across the board for, anxiety around finances is incredibly powerful. A loss of revenue creates so much insecurity and precarity in people's lives when it comes to their housing, when it comes to, people were sharing that they were unable to keep the heat on, and these all of these have a ripple across different physical and mental health factors. So it was pretty devastating.
It is. It's interesting. I this is a bit of a sidebar, but I recently got one of those Aura rings that like measures your health really closely and
Mm-hmm.
your physiology. And a weekend ago, I was going through my finances. It's end of Q4. I'm trying to figure out my budget for next year and go through transactions for the bookkeeper. And that entire day, when I was sitting down to do that, my stress levels were at all-time highs,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's not like a physically taxing event. Like I'm not getting up and running a marathon, right? I'm just sitting at my kitchen table, miserable. But it was such a physiological response to a mental stress. So like I have a hard time because I think just naturally as a person you can be hard on yourself and be like, this isn't that big a deal, like power through, get over it, whatever. We're
Mm-hmm.
always our worst critics, but to see the way something like finances actually impacts your health and wellness like directly in real time, that was really kind of a crazy experience and awakening for me.
Yeah, it really takes a toll.
It does. So you collected survey data from online creators. Can you kind of explain how you designed your research and then the methods that you used?
Yeah, so this was, I want to say just the data that you collect is so important because we often don't have that real time data around creator communities. And when the MasterCard rules were coming down the pipeline, I was actually finishing my dissertation and getting ready for my defense. So I was like, I really don't have time for this, but I want to capture what's going on right now because it's going to be important that we have some kind of data for how this is impacting people. So I tried to make a pretty quick and concise survey that would capture enough data that was meaningful, but without being too much of a burden on people to complete, because I also wasn't able to offer people compensation or anything for their time, just by the nature of the anonymous survey. So I was still in university at Memorial University, and they have a kind of survey platform that I was able to use called Qualtrics. It's really secure. And I put together my questions. I shared that with a few people just to see if I was missing anything or better ways to phrase everything. Wanted to try and, have a bit of a review of it rather than just throwing it out right away. But then launched that survey online through Twitter, and it got shared around some other groups and listservs and things like that. And my background is much more qualitative research. I've studied, anthropology, and I normally like to take a lot of time and do field work and lawn interviews and things like that. But that, of course, just wasn't the right way to address this issue. I wanted to capture a lot of insight really quickly. So it was mostly, kind of multiple choice, like a select all that apply type questions with some text box, because I also knew people were so scared and frustrated, and there wasn't necessarily as many places as people would have liked to share those frustrations. So even just having the text boxes available for people to go off and talk about what was how this was really messing up their revenue and their creation. So then I've used those multiple choice type questions for more statistical answers, and had the text boxes for the more in-depth qualitative quotes. And the chapter really does a combination of both. But it was, I had to go back to my old stats textbook to kind of remember how to do the statistics piece, because that is not my not my forte as an anthropologist.
Yeah. Did you actually encounter any obstacles while trying to conduct this research? I'm wondering. And if so, like, how did you navigate them? Because I mean, it's not an easy task what you're trying to do and to measure.
Right. Well, luckily, I had a university that was really quite understanding. I've heard people with having a lot of horror stories from their ethics boards refusing to approve research that has anything to do with sex work. Luckily, I'm Canadian, and my university was a little more liberal, I guess, in this respect. And because I was already doing a project on pornography and occupational health, they were really helpful in expediting my ethics approval to just tag it on to my existing dissertation research because they felt it was close enough, it had enough in common that it constituted part of the same project. So I was able to get through my ethics approval pretty swiftly, and that was the main sort of administrative hoop that I had to jump through. And as I said, we had access to this research platform, this survey platform through our student status. So that was really helpful. And then people were really on Twitter and across different creator networks were really helpful in distributing it and helping get eyes on it. So that was that was something I was really grateful to for people sharing that around.
Yeah, when the community connects, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
I can relate. I'd like to talk about the impacts that you uncovered and kind of what they mean for sex workers, because I feel like that's what people are tuning in and curious about. And I think that that gives a great, I guess, view of what they can get from this book and a little, taste of it.
Hmm.
MasterCard's 2021 guidelines were a major focus in your chapter. What were, I guess, the most significant ways that these policies disrupted sex workers' livelihoods?
Right. So in the chapter, I go through a few different parts of this. So I asked everyone about different impacts that they'd had in terms of account closures or account warnings, having to update their ID and verification, or different ways that content had to be approved moving forward. And the things that I found most were people had to sort of re-verify content, or it took a lot longer for content to get verified. So there were just all of these slowdowns in terms of their ability to put content up and monetize it. And that obviously had a major impact on people's revenue. So just the slowing down and the way that the new identification policies across different platforms were really cumbersome and just didn't make a lot of sense. A lot of people talked about having to produce ID that was currently valid, even if the content they had posted was 10 years old, right? And as if there was a risk that people in the content had aged backwards and their ID would no longer be valid or something. Um, and just, or having to show, the backs of IDs for content that previously existed. And we don't always keep in touch with people we shot content with 2, 5, 10 years ago, right? So it's not always very possible to get ID from people in the past. And I remember at this time a couple of companies reaching out to me to ask for extra photos of my ID and the backs of IDs for content that I'd filmed 10, 15 years ago, right? Just so that they can continue to have it online. Luckily, they still had my phone number, right? But that wasn't the case for everybody.
Yeah.
And then there was a lot of just flagging and closure of accounts, but in particular, kink content being flagged and banned across a lot of platforms. And this is something I just released a paper actually that looks more specifically at this that I co-wrote with Rebecca Franco, who's another great researcher in this area. And a lot of people talking about having their previously approved content in maybe hypnosis or sort of BDSM content, things that were flirting with notions of coercion and non-consent, all being really harshly moderated now under the new guidelines. So that was a major issue for a lot of creators.
It was like around this time, even as a non-marginalized creator on something like OnlyFans, it's like all these new banned words rolled out, and
Yeah.
suddenly I'm getting flagged for content that was posted to my page, 4 years ago that I've got to go try to track down and replace or edit the way I just, captioned it. And to your point about even the IDs with some of the new age verification policies that they're trying to pass right now, I'm in the state of Tennessee, which has one where they want you to ID verify more frequently, like every hour or so. I forget the time interval, but multiple times while you're on the website, as if you, like you say, age backwards.
Yeah.
So the ID stuff is really peculiar, but To your point, a lot of that kink and fetish content, yeah, it got moderated really harshly, and it was like overnight, everything seemed to be flagged.
Yeah, and the burden on workers to go back, like you said, to locate all of that content, edit everything, reapprove things, it just created such a backlog for everybody that, again, speaking to the mental health and stress that this created, even for people who, yeah, were able to get all of that stuff reapproved, just the labor involved.
Yeah.
The it was, really, really impactful. Or even in the case of, for example, with OnlyFans, you know, threatening to remove adult and then going back on it. A lot of subscribers, people talked about losing a lot of subscribers because they lost confidence in the platform, and in other platforms around this time, and so there was a loss of subscribers, just
Mhm.
loss of revenue in so many different ways.
Yeah, it was unexpected for me because I remember specifically at that time when the OnlyFans ban came out. That month, I made almost 10K less than the month before, just as a result of them saying they were going to ban it and then walking it back. Because people forget, like, the way the subscriptions on some of these fan sites work, like the customer, and as they should be, I think, is really in control. They can, click that renew button or keep the rebill off, and that's great. But once they turn it off, it's very hard for someone to like remember to go out of their way to turn it back on or to resubscribe. Like, it's hard to capture and convert fans as it is online. We don't have the same consumer, I guess, privileges of like a one-click purchase. Like, we don't get a lot of those benefits in our industry. So once you've said something and you've put it out there in the world, it has such a rippling effect on the way consumer behavior plays out and on the way we have to conduct business. And it was very instant, and it was felt very harshly. Oh God, I remember that day vividly. It was awful.
Yeah, and I did ask people about their specific amount of income loss, monthly income loss, in terms of sort of more the percentage of their regular income that they lost. And it was pretty shocking. Like, it was 75% had some kind of drop in sales, and over half of them had lost 50% or more of their monthly income, which you can imagine, like, just having your monthly income halved or
Yeah.
more, on, yeah, like you said, like on a dime, right? That
Yeah.
it was really unexpected. And not everyone has the benefit of, having something in the bank to fall back on, right? And a lot of people were already living paycheck to paycheck. So it was, as much as some creators maybe weren't making a whole lot, the loss of they had come to rely upon, even if they had other work, was felt
Mhm.
really, really intensely.
Yeah. Financial discrimination, as you mentioned earlier, it tends to hit the marginalized groups the hardest. What do you think people need to understand about the intersections of like race, gender, and ability kind of within our sex work industry?
Yeah, that's a huge question. But I think in terms of this research and thinking through specifically content moderation and banking discrimination, we know that moderation, a lot of it is done through AI and other sort of automated systems, and that those automated systems have inherent bias built into them because they are trained on biased decisions of humans, right? So we know that from the jump, a lot of the moderation has really racist and sizist and ciscentric bias built into it, and then you add on top of that that marginalized groups are less likely to have access to have a financial safety net for a whole host of reasons in terms of just systemic racism and transphobia. So there's this layering of effects where discrimination gets built into policies and decisions and the ways that they're carried out through both human and automated moderation. But I think on zooming out to just when we think about the regulation of sex, it's always non-normative sexualities that are most impacted, right? And that means anything that falls outside of like a white, ciscentric, heteronormative, vanilla type of sexuality, that's always what is going to get attacked first when there is some kind of call to wipe out obscenity or to wipe out exploitation, quote unquote exploitation. And so in this case where Visa and MasterCard were really ostensibly talking about ensuring that content is made consensually and that we're ensuring that everything that's operating on the platforms is above board, it sounds good, right? That sounds like a great thing to be ensuring, but it ultimately came down to moderating things that by one very particular standard doesn't look uh, doesn't look a certain way, right? So thinking through how these policies are ultimately about upholding a very particular kind of sexual morality is something that I've been thinking about more and more with this work.
Yeah, there's so many challenges, and so much of this stuff, it has a lot of relevance right now, right? Like, because there's a lot of the same problems and challenges that are bleeding into the age
Yeah.
verification conversation and all of this stuff. And we're in a new administration, and there's a lot of concern around all of these challenges. But I also found that your chapter specifically also highlights, the resilience among sex workers. And I'm wondering if you could share maybe some examples of how workers are pushing back and kind of fostering strength within our community, because I think that message should be almost balanced with the positive and the
Mm.
and the potential that we're seeing, because otherwise it can feel so bleak.
Yeah, it's good to think about the successes or even just the resistance when it isn't quote unquote successful. It's still important for remembering that we can push back. And yeah, I think the Acceptance Matters campaign that was done at the time was a really powerful rallying of support, and I think that website is still up, which I link to in the chapter. So that was a group of sex workers and creators and allies coming together to share sort of testimonials about the impact that the MasterCard rules were having or were likely to have. And there was some in-person protests at banks in some cities. And I was just double checking today to see if there were any updates, but the ACLU did file an FTC complaint against MasterCard at this, I think it was in August of last year, that I'm not sure where that's at. I imagine these processes are slow, but, so there's been some attempts to go through really these sort of official channels to push back on MasterCard for discriminatory policies against sex workers. And then I think about, the work that you've done with the Free Speech Coalition around, gathering data and pushing back against banking discrimination in that report that you co-authored. There's been more and more community-based research that, tries to skirt this line, this really important line between sort of formal academic research, which I, as a researcher, love this field, but also it can be so slow and so laborious. It can take so long to get things out when we need this information to come out more swiftly. So finding that line between sort of op-eds that we can push out really quickly and then rigorous research, I feel like there's a lot of things going on now that really balance between those two, which is helpful information for us to have when we're doing advocacy in response to these policies. But also just, aside from those channels, I see constantly performers creating networks and ways to share information with one another, to share tips and resources, to help each other navigate and circumvent these rules and, find ways to speed their or to help their workflow be not so cumbersome and tiring. And those kind of mutual aid processes are invaluable, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think, like, I'm listening to this conversation, and my head goes to, like, if magically this came across a financial institution's speaker or phone, or they tap into a podcast episode, very unlikely, right? But if they were willing to listen,
Mm.
I'm curious what specific policy changes you might recommend based on your findings.
Yeah, I wish they would listen. It's but it's tricky because credit card companies are not equipped to regulate sexual content. They are not media specialists. They are not experts in sexuality or in, this is not their field. They're concerned with the reputation of their brand. They are concerned with, abiding by legal restrictions and brand reputation, and that's it, right? And we just cannot create policy on that basis that isn't going to be harmful to people. That's sort of impossible. So I think that when we're talking about content moderation on platforms and the ways that credit cards should be concerned with the moderation of that content, to me, the only line needs to be ensuring the content was made consensually and that there is consent to distribute it. And beyond that, the content itself, the themes, I just don't think there's any way to moderate that isn't going to be drawing the line in a way that's problematic and that harms marginalized creators. So that's what I would call for in terms of moderation standards. Is we find a way to verify consent, but we find a way to do that isn't disrespectful of creators' time and energy, that respects their privacy and security, protects their intellectual property and their creative property. And that requires creators to be at the forefront of designing and determining how content is verified. So what I would say is make creators in charge of how we conduct verification and moderation decisions, and start from there.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. There's this other part of the book that I think, we've talked about this idea before on our channels, but we don't talk about it or revisit it all that often. And it's this idea of like a whorearchy in our community. Could you, I guess, first maybe start by defining the term for, the new creators or baby sex workers that are tuning in? But also, I'm curious how you see this affecting the solidarity in our community and also the activism that we're trying to do.
Yeah, so it's funny, the Whorearchy, I just put a question on this on an exam for my class that they just finished. It's, the way that there's many different definitions, I suppose, but the way that I would define it is the way that different types of sex work are sometimes arranged hierarchically in terms of how much they are stigmatized. And so this can translate into sort of lateral oppression amongst sex workers, where people might judge other kinds of sex workers for the type of work that they do. But it also translates into how sort of civilian populations and non-sex worker populations think about different kinds of sex work differently, and seeing some as more respectable and other kinds as, dirty or less valid or valuable. So it's that sort of ranking of types of sex work. And a lot of times that ranking seems to align with how criminalized is the work, what kind of proximity do the workers have to law enforcement, what kind of proximity do they have to their clients, and how much money do they make, right? And are they working, sort of the venue they're working out of, or the type of work that they're doing. So that's not a very concise definition of the hierarchy, but
I think it articulates the point perfectly, and I think that creators and sex workers, they may not understand why this kind of ranking divides us when it comes to issues that affect all of us, essentially.
And so what I have seen in terms of advocacy across the sex work world in the last 5 years even, is a lessening of that hierarchy, more solidarity across types of sex work. And I think there's a few reasons for that. I think, one, more people are doing multiple kinds of sex work, perhaps. And so people are more likely to have a foot in different sectors. As well, we're seeing how the criminalization of in-person sex work is having really direct consequences on people that may have never done in-person sex work, who are only doing online content creation. And so these struggles are completely interrelated. There's no way to parse out, most people don't care if your work is legal or not when it comes to the way that MasterCard is going to, mandate the themes of your content, right? Like it's MasterCard and Visa rules might be ostensibly concerned with ensuring that content is legal, but actually it's, is this content palatable for our brand? So the lines between legal and illegal don't save you when it comes to the impacts of credit card processors and content moderation, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. I think then the final kind of like, I guess, closing remarks and I guess big thing I want to focus on, because there's so many things we spoke about in this space, and there's so much to even continue and widen topic wise within the context of the entire book. But sex work today just covers such a wide range of topics, from digital sex work to mutual aid to combating stigma. I guess my question is, what do you hope that readers take away from the book? Like, if there was one thing, what would that be?
Ooh. I think the importance of focusing on sex work as an interconnected labor issue, and I guess ultimately really just the importance of listening to sex workers about the realities of sex work, right? Putting those
Yeah,
voices at the forefront.
absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I'm so grateful that you took the time to do this with us and to just come on and chat and share your research and your findings and how you found it, and even some of your own personal experience. This was really, really valuable. Can you let everyone listening know where they can get the book and where they can find your stuff?
So the book is through NYU Press, so you can go directly to their website, or if you go to like a local bookstore in your city and ask them to order it in, that's a really good way to do it, rather than going to some of the other online spaces where one might get a book. But so I'd definitely recommend hitting your independent bookstore, if you have one, to have them order it in. And this is probably like my last hurrah on Twitter. I'm not over here so much anymore for all the reasons, but I am on Blue Sky at publicpubics.bsy.social. So that's where you can find me on socials. And then my website is valeriewebber.com. And that's where there's links to all of my research and videos and podcasts and things like that. And those are my online presence. I mean, you could probably find my porn somewhere too, but I'm not going to share those names.
Valid. So valid. Thank you so much, Val, for coming on and taking the time to speak with us. I know so many creators are going to get tremendous value from this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. As many of you guys have seen, as we wrap up the space, I guess I'll just kind of plug a few things. We have released some new YouTube content, course-wise and otherwise, on our YouTube channel. So if you want to check that out, youtube.com/SWCEO. If you're not already using GPTs and you want to be, there are tons of tips, advice, strategies, prompts that you can use. All the conversations about GPTs are being had inside CEO Society, our close community for adult creators. So if you'd like to check that out, you can do so over at ceosociety.app. That's going to bring us to the end of today's Twitter Space. Huge thank you to everyone who joined in. And please remember that these Twitter Spaces are turned into blog posts over on our website, sexworkceo.com. So just head on over there in a week or so to revisit any and all of the ideas we talked about in today's episode. Make sure you get a copy of the book, Sex Work Today, when it comes out. It is worth the read. It is worth staying informed on our industry and on our community. Thank you again for joining me, CEO Squad, and I'll see you all next week.
It would be absolutely incredible if you rated this podcast 5 stars and left a little review. We want to get this podcast to as many adult creators as possible, and you taking a second to leave a couple stars and a review really helps us do that. Thanks so much.